Hello, so we are here today to look at consent, and this is the AO1 needed for an essay or a scenario question. So first of all, it is a full defence. This means it leads to a complete acquittal. It's a key area when it comes to non-fatal offences. So this is where you're going to find it in a scenario question. It will be linked to non-fatal offences. So our starting point for consent is the Attorney General reference case. Now, the Attorney General said it's not in the public interest to cause ABH or GBH to each other unless it's a recognised exception. So the first issue to look at is sport. Sport is a recognised exception. However, the cases of Barnes and Billinghurst come into play here. So Barnes said we're only going to prosecute if it's sufficiently criminal. And then Billinghurst said you can only consent to injury within the rules of the game. So this is providing some limit on the defence. The next issue is implied consent. Now, every time you go, I don't know, on the tube in London, it's going to be busy. You're going to knock into people. You are going to commit battery. However, we cannot charge everybody on the tube with battery. So by going onto the tube, you are giving implied consent to battery. And Wilson and Pringle said this, it's not a battery. Everyday jostlings are not battery. The next issue is surgery. Now, you can give your consent, even if you're under 18, to surgery and medical treatment, as long as you are Gillick competent. And that comes from the case of Gillick. So Mrs. Gillick wanted to stop girls under 16 getting the pill. And the doctor said, no, they can consent. And the courts agreed with them. They can consent if they fully understand the nature of what they are consenting to. So if you are Gillick competent, you can consent to medical treatment. In Richardson, maybe a bit surprising, the decision. She was a dentist and she was suspended and she gave medical or dental treatment to people. She was convicted of ABH, but on appeal they quashed it because they said that the patients had consented to dental treatment from a dentist. This links into the next point that consent must be valid and true. You have to give real consent. There are various cases you can discuss. Tabassum, the women who were examined by a fake doctor who said he was doing research for breast cancer. They consented to the nature of the act, which was having their breasts examined. However, they didn't consent to the quality of the act because he was not doing it for medical reasons. Other cases you can use Dika, where the man knew he had HIV and he slept with two women and they contracted HIV. Yes, they consented to sex. It wasn't rape. However, they did not consent to the quality of the sex in terms of they didn't consent to having sex with somebody with HIV. The next issue is that consent through fear is not valid consent, and that's the case of Olug Boja. So she watched her friend being raped and she consented, except she didn't consent because it was through fear. You can't consent to death. The case of Diane Pretty said that. So Pretty, you can't consent to death because that would then be euthanasia. And in this country, euthanasia is illegal. The next issue is horseplay. Now, you can consent to horseplay. You've got Jones, where they gave the boys the bumps, and then you've got Aitken with the RAF officers when they set their friend on fire. Now, in Aitken, they made a mistake about the consent. They thought their friend would consent to their fire-resistant suit being set on fire. So, yes, they had a defence to that because it was an honest mistake. Next issue is harmful sexual activity. So the infamous case, the one you're always going to remember in years to come, is the case of Brown, where a group of men performed sadomasochistic acts on each other and they caused ABH and GBH. Now, this was in private. They were fully consenting adults. In this case, the House of Lords said you cannot consent to ABH and GBH unless it's an exception. So they said, one, all five agreed you can consent to assault and battery. You can't consent to ABH or GBH. And then the decision was 3-2 about was sadomasochism a recognised exception, and 3 of the law lords said it's not an exception. In other words, they are guilty, and 2 disagreed. So 3-2, sadomasochism is not a recognised exception. You've then got the case of Wilson. Court of Appeal distinguished in Wilson, and they said that the man who branded his wife's buttocks with his initials, they said, well, branding is like a tattoo, and we know that a tattoo is a recognised exception, so therefore it's not like brand. So the Court of Appeal distinguished from the House of Lords to avoid following precedent. And then finally, reform proposals. In 1996, the Law Commission said you should be able to consent to injury, but not to serious injury. So pretty much the same as where we are at the moment in the law. So those are the 10 key points for consent. I'm now going to do another video on the AO3 for an essay.